The gymnasium went silent the moment Minjun let go of his father's coat and crossed the polished floor. 6 years old, back straight the way Korean children are taught to stand, he walked past 40 folding chairs and 40 staring parents until he reached the woman with the dark skin and the tired eyes. He took Amara Okafor's hand in both of his and walked towards Zuri. "Can my dad keep your mommy?" he asked, clear as a temple bell. "Just for today?" Nobody breathed. Somewhere a chair scraped once. Amara felt the whole room turn. But her daughter Zuri wasn't looking at the boy. The little girl had gone rigid, 6 years old and suddenly carved from stone, her small juice box slipping from her fingers to burst pale across the floor. She was staring past Minjun at the man in the doorway. At his wrist. "Zuri," Amara whispered. "Baby, what is it?" Zuri didn't answer. She couldn't, because she had seen something no one else in that room could see, and it had stopped her heart. Welcome to AfroKorean Stories by Janet, besties. Please like, share, and subscribe. Comment below where you are watching from and what time it is over there. Before we go into today's story, if you love powerful mafia boss romances filled with passion, secrets, shocking twists, and unforgettable happy endings, you'll love the Ultimate Mafia Boss Love Collection. It includes 15 complete stories, 20 audiobooks, plus 5 exclusive bonus stories you won't find on YouTube. You can grab your copy through the link in the description. Now, let's begin. To understand why a 6-year-old stopped breathing in a room full of strangers, you have to understand the woman standing beside her, and you have to go back further than that gymnasium, further than that morning. You have to go back to a night 3 years earlier at the Olympic Expressway, and a good man died with his hands at 10 and 2 and a question still unanswered on his laptop screen. But first you should know who Amara was before all of it, because she did not always have tired eyes. Once, she believed the world was fair. She had come to Korea at 26, stepping off the plane at Incheon with one suitcase, a linguistic scholarship, and the unshakable confidence of a young woman who had never yet been taught otherwise. Lagos had raised her loud and certain. Her mother sold fabric in Balogun Market and could out-argue a tax officer. Her father taught secondary school English and believed education was a door no one could lock behind you. Amara had inherited both the argument and the belief, and she carried them across the world to a peninsula where almost no one looked like her. Seoul in autumn had astonished her. The ginkgo trees on the University Avenue turned the color of turmeric and dropped their leaves in drifts, and the whole city smelled of roasting chestnuts and cold air. She learned the language the way she did everything, head first and without apology, until the ajumas at the corner shop stopped speaking slowly to her and started gossiping at full speed, which she decided was the truest citizenship Korea could offer. She learned to bow at the right depth. She learned that ajuma was not an insult but a crown. She learned the difference between the polite ending and the intimate one, and she learned, slowly, that some doors here would open for her and some never would, no matter how perfect her grammar. She met Seo Junho in the reading room of the National Library, where he had fallen asleep over a ledger the size of a paving stone. He woke to find her reading the spine of his book over his shoulder, and instead of being embarrassed, he asked her opinion on it. That was the thing about Junho that she would spend the rest of her life trying to explain to people who had never met him. He was a forensic accountant, a man who spent his days finding the lie hidden inside other people's numbers, and yet he had somehow reached his 30s without learning to flinch. He did not flinch at her name, which he practiced until he could say Okafor with the K landing exactly where her father put it. He did not flinch at her skin, at the second looks on the subway, at the aunties who asked him in front of her whether he had considered how the children would look. He simply took her hand on the escalator down into Yulgiro Station, in front of all of Seoul, and held it. The night he proposed, he cooked. This mattered, later, more than either of them could have known. He was a disaster in a kitchen, and he knew it. So the fact that he had spent an entire Saturday learning to make doenjang jjigae from a video his grandmother would have been ashamed of was itself the proposal, before he ever said a word. The stew was too salty. The tofu had disintegrated into the broth. He set the bubbling stone pot in front of her in his tiny Mangwon apartment, wiped his hands on a dish towel printed with cartoon rabbits, and said, in Korean, then again in the careful English he'd been practicing, "I want to eat badly made stew with you until we are old. Marry me." She said yes with her mouth full, which he never let her forget. His family did not come to the wedding. The Seos were old Taegu money, the kind that measured itself in generations and land and the particular Korean arithmetic of face. Junho's mother had a way of looking at Amara that required no translation in any language, a slow settling of the eyes that catalogued her and closed the ledger. To her, Amara was not a person but a rumor that would attach itself to the family name and never wash out. When Junho announced the engagement, his mother said only one sentence, and Junho refused for the rest of his life to repeat it. Amara knew the shape of it anyway. She had heard versions of it in 3 languages on 2 continents. So they married without them, in a small hall in Hongdae, with Junho's university friends and a handful of Amara's fellow international students and the reading room librarian who had watched the whole thing bloom. Amara wore white, and a gelly her mother had shipped from Lagos, gold and impossible, and when she walked in, Junho laughed out loud with joy and had to be told twice to stop crying at his own wedding. His mother's absence sat in the room like an empty chair, and both of them agreed, silently, to build a life so full there would be no space left to notice it. For a while they did. Zuri arrived 2 years later, in the deep cold of a February that froze the Han solid at the edges. She came out furious and stayed that way, all coils and lungs, and Junho held her in the hospital and wept again, because weeping at the important things turned out to be the only thing he was bad at hiding. They raised her between 2 worlds, without apology. She fell asleep to Igbo lullabies her grandmother sang down a crackling phone line and woke to her father murmuring the Korean words for the parts of her face. She would grow up to argue in one language and dream in the other, and never once find that strange, because to her it was simply the shape of a family. And she fell asleep, every night without exception, to the ticking of her father's watch. It was not an expensive thing. Junho could have afforded better and never wanted it. The watch had belonged to his own father, an old automatic with a scratched face and a leather strap that had cracked and been repaired and cracked again, and it ticked with a sound just loud enough that a baby laid against her father's chest could feel it as much as hear it. Zuri would not sleep without it. On the nights Junho worked late, Amara would press her ear to the child's back and mimic the sound herself, tick, 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 and it was never quite enough, and the child always knew the difference. Remember the watch? Amara did not for a long time. That was the whole tragedy of it. The last month of Junho's life, he changed. It was small at first, the kind of thing only a wife would notice. He stopped sleeping. He took calls in the stairwell of their apartment building, and when he came back his face was arranged into a calm that did not reach his eyes. He was working on an audit he would not discuss, which was itself unusual because he discussed everything with her, talked through his cases at the kitchen table while she corrected his English and he corrected her math. But this one he kept in a folder he carried everywhere and left open on his laptop only when he thought she was asleep. One night she woke at 2 in the morning and found him at the kitchen table, the blue light of the screen on his face, and she saw, before he tilted the lid down, a company name at the top of a document. A logistics firm. She would not remember it correctly for 3 years, and when she finally did remember it, the memory would arrive like a blade. "Come to bed," she said. "Soon," he said and smiled at her, and it was the smile he used on his mother's absence and on the aunties on the subway, the smile that held a door shut. "I found something at work. It's nothing. Go back to sleep, my heart." He fastened his watch every morning, even on the mornings he did not leave the house. It was the last thing he did before he became the version of himself the world was allowed to see. On the last morning of his life, he stood in their doorway with the strap not yet buckled, and Zuri, 3 years old, reached up from Amara's arms and helped him press it closed with her fat, determined fingers, and he kissed the top of her head and told her she was the strongest person he knew. Then he drove onto the Olympic expressway in the rain, and he never came home. They called it a single-car accident. The road was wet, the barrier gave, the car went down the embankment and into the dark. There were no other vehicles involved, the report said. No signs of anything but a man driving too fast on a bad night. Amara read that report so many times the paper went soft at the folds. She was 32 years old, and she had a 3-year-old asleep against a silence where a ticking used to be, and she believed, because she still believed the world was fair, that grief was the worst thing that could happen to her. She was wrong about that, too. The funeral was the first time she saw his family in the flesh. They arrived in black cars and black clothes and a wall of relatives she had never met, and they moved through the funeral hall as though Amara were a piece of furniture that had been left there by mistake. Junho's mother did not speak to her. When Amara, holding Zuri, stepped forward to bow at the altar where her husband's photograph smiled its unguarded smile, an uncle stepped smoothly into her path, and the message was as clear as the mother's single sentence 3 years before. "You are not one of us. You never were. They took everything." It was not complicated. In the end, the way these things are never complicated for people with old money and older lawyers. The apartment had been in Junho's name, and the name reverted to the family. The savings, the insurance, the small inheritance from his father that Junho had always said would be Zuri's someday, all of it flowed back up the bloodline and closed over as if she had never existed. A cousin came to the apartment while Amara was at the funeral hall and packed Junho's things into boxes and carried them away. His clothes, his books, his grandmother's stew pot. And, though Amara did not know it yet, and would not know it for 3 long years, the watch was not among the things they took, because the watch was not in the apartment at all. The watch had been in the car. Amara asked about it, once, in the weeks after, when she was still capable of asking his family for anything. She called Junho's mother and, in her most careful honorifics, asked whether her husband's watch had been recovered, because her daughter could not sleep, because it was the only thing she wanted, because it was the one small piece of him a 3-year-old could hold. There was a silence on the line. Then Junho's mother said the last words she would ever say to Amara. She said, "There was no watch." And she hung up. Amara believed her. Why would she not? She folded that grief in with all the others and carried it down into the years that followed, into the apartment half the size of the old one, into the mornings that started at 4. But there had been a watch. And somewhere in Seoul, that very night, a man she had not yet met sat alone in a dark room, turning a scratched old timepiece over and over in his hands, listening to it tick, and beginning to understand exactly what he had let happen. She never asked his family again. She learned instead to stop asking anyone for anything, which is a skill and a wound and the beginning of everything that came next. 3 years is a long time to learn how to disappear in a city of 10 million people. Amara learned it the way she learned everything thoroughly. She learned which convenience stores marked down the gimbap at 9 at night and which landlords would rent to a foreign woman with a child and no husband, and which would look at her over their glasses and suddenly remember the room was taken. She found 2 rooms and a half-basement in a neighborhood far from Gangnam, where the window sat at ankle height to the alley and the damp came up through the floor in the rainy season and bloomed on the walls in shapes she taught Zuri to see as animals, so the child would laugh instead of cry. A rabbit, a dragon, a fat sleeping cat. She took the jobs no one else wanted, because they were the jobs that would take her. Before dawn, she cleaned a jimjilbang in the hours between the last drunk salaryman staggering out and the first retirees shuffling in for their morning soak. She mopped the tiled floors of the bathhouse and wiped down the wooden shelves of the sleeping room and scrubbed the little eggs and siki counter until it shone, and she was paid in cash, and the manager's assumption that a woman who looked like her was lucky to have it. There was one mercy in that place, and her name was Boksun, though Amara only ever called her emo, auntie, the way you addressed a woman who had earned it. Boksun was 70 if she was a day, built like a rice sack and twice as stubborn, and she ran the food counter with an iron ladle and a running commentary on the failings of everyone under 60. On Amara's first morning, Boksun had watched the new cleaner work for exactly 1 hour, then set a bowl of sujibi on the counter without a word, the hand-torn dough dumplings steaming in an anchovy broth she made herself before anyone else arrived. "Eat," Boksun had said. "You're too thin. Thin women mop badly." There was no logic in it, and Amara had eaten it standing up with tears in her eyes she blamed on the steam, and that was the beginning of the only thing in Seoul that felt like being claimed. Boksun called her Yuri Amara, our Amara, the way she might have said our girl, and to a woman who had been made furniture at her own husband's funeral, that small possessive was a country all its own. "That man came in again," Boksun announced one morning, meaning nothing by it yet, ladling broth. "The one with the shiny shoes and the men who walk behind him. Soaked in the good bath for an hour, tipped like a fool, said nothing to anybody. Something's wrong with a man that quiet." Amara wasn't listening. She was watching the clock because at 7 she became a different person. By day she taught English at a hagwon in Gangnam, one of the glittering cram school towers where the children of the wealthy were fed education by the hour, like fuel into a furnace. She was good at it, better than good, and the parents who would not have invited her into their homes paid handsomely for their children to sit in her classroom, because a native fluent teacher was a native fluent teacher, and the market, unlike the country, did not care what she looked like. She taught 7-year-olds to say "I would like" instead of "I want," and she thought, every single day, about the difference between those two sentences and about how much of her life had drained out through the gap between them. Zuri came with her to the hagwon in the afternoons, to the daycare room on the 3rd floor where the staff let the teachers' children wait. And it was there, in that fluorescent room that smelled of rice crackers and floor cleaner, on an ordinary Tuesday in the plum rain season, that a quiet boy with a bowl haircut and a serious face walked up to Zuri Okafor, held out a single jeju tangerine in both hands like an offering at a shrine, and changed the course of both their lives. "You can have this," Minjun said. "You looked like you wanted one." Zuri, who was 6 and did not believe in accepting things from strangers, looked at the tangerine, then at the boy, then back at the tangerine. "Why?" she said. It was not a question. Zuri's why was never a question. It was an interrogation, and it had made grown women cry. Minjun considered this with the gravity of a small diplomat. "Because you were sitting alone," he said. "And my mom used to say tangerines are for sitting alone." Then he set it down beside her and walked back to his corner and did not bother her again, which was, as far as Zuri was concerned, the single most respectful thing anyone had ever done. She peeled the tangerine in one long spiral, the way her father had taught her before she could remember being taught, and she ate half and carried the other half across the room and set it down beside this strange, serious boy without a word, and a friendship was built, as the best ones are, entirely out of fruit and silence. Amara noticed none of it that first day. She was grading workbooks and thinking about the electricity bill. She noticed the boy's father a week later, and him she could not fail to notice, because the whole daycare rearranged itself around him when he came through the door. He arrived at closing time in a long dark coat, and the staff who were normally so brisk went soft and low and bowed too deeply, the way people bow when the bowing is not really respect but something with fear folded inside it. Two men waited by the elevator with their hands crossed in front of them and their eyes moving over the room. And in the center of it walked a man of maybe 40, with a still face and shoulders that took up more space than they should, a man the entire staff addressed as Sejangnim, boss, president, sir, with an emphasis that made the word mean something heavier than a title. Amara pulled Zuri back, toward her on instinct. Every mother in the room did the same with her own child, a small tide of protective motion, and the man saw it happen, and something crossed his still face and was gone before she could name it. He crouched down to his son's level. And the feared man, the man the whole floor was afraid of, reached out to gather his boy's coat closed against the evening cold and completely, hopelessly failed to fasten the toggle. He tried 3 times. His hands were too big, or the toggle too small, or the grief too fresh, and Amara watched Kong Teo, whose name she did not yet know, whose empire she could not yet imagine, kneel on the floor of a Hagwon daycare and lose a silent battle with his own son's coat, while 2 enforcers watched and pretended not to. Minjun, patient as a monk, waited. Finally, the boy took his father's enormous hands in his small ones, guided them, and pushed the toggle through himself. "Like this, Appa," Minjun said. "I showed you already." "You did," the man said. His voice was very low. "I forgot." And Amara, who had spent 3 years building a wall around herself brick by careful brick, felt one brick, exactly one, come loose. She did not want it to. She knew what men like that were. She had cleaned the bathhouse floor for men like that. But she had also once helped a man buckle a watch he could manage perfectly well on his own, simply because the doing of it was love, and she recognized, across a crowded room, the specific helplessness of a parent who did not know how to do the small tender things the missing one used to do. She looked away before he could catch her watching. But that night, in the half-basement, she lay awake longer than the exhaustion should have allowed, and she thought about a man who could command a room and could not close a code, and she was angry at herself for thinking about him at all. The next morning there was an envelope in her mailbox. It was not addressed. It was not stamped. Inside was a single sheet of heavy paper, embossed at the top with the name of a foundation she had never heard of, and beneath it, in formal Korean, a notification that Zuri Okafor had been selected as the recipient of a full childhood education scholarship, all fees and materials covered through the end of elementary school, no application required, no response necessary, no name to thank. Amara stood in the cold stairwell in her cleaning clothes and read it 4 times. She had not applied for anything. She had told no one her daughter's full legal name, not the daycare, not the hagwon, not Boksun. And yet here it was in black embossed ink, a gift with no hand attached to it, and she felt, standing there, not gratitude, but the first cold finger of a question she could not yet shape. Who was watching her closely enough to know her daughter's name? And why would someone with that kind of money reach down into a half-basement in the wrong part of the city to lift up a child who is nothing to them? She folded the letter and put it in her pocket, and she told herself she would find out. But she was so tired, and the world had taught her that when something finally goes right, you do not turn it over to look for the rot. So she let it go. She should not have let it go. But what she found when she finally pulled that thread was not what she was looking for. What she found, when she finally let herself pull the thread 3 weeks later, was Kong Teo standing at the top of her basement stairs at 9 o'clock on a Thursday night, alone, with no black cars and no men in the alley, holding 2 plastic bags of groceries and looking as though he would rather be facing a firing squad. Amara opened the door with Zuri's dinner still on her hands and every wall she owned slamming back into place at once. Sayanknim. She used the title the daycare used, and she made it a fence. You're at the wrong door. I'm at the right door, he said. That's the problem. He looked down at the bags in his hands, as if surprised to find them there. I overstepped. The scholarship. I know you know it was me. My people are not as invisible as they think. He set the bags down carefully on the top step, keeping his distance, a man who understood exactly how large he was and how small a stairwell could make a woman feel. I came to apologize. Not to buy anything. There's hoback juk in there, the pumpkin porridge. My son says your daughter had a cough. That's all. I'll go. He turned to go. And Amara, who had rehearsed 100 cold dismissals in 3 years of practicing them on her own reflection, heard herself say the last thing she intended to say. Why my daughter? He stopped on the stairs. For a moment he didn't turn around, and when he did, the still face had something moving under it. Because my son eats lunch alone, he said, except on the days your daughter sits with him. Because a woman who works 2 jobs shouldn't have a child who learns worse than a child whose father buys the school a new wing. He paused. And because I know what it is to raise a child in a country that has already decided about them, I thought I could make one thing easier. I did it wrong. Clumsy. I'm sorry. Then he climbed the stairs and was gone, and Amara stood in her doorway holding the fence she had built out of one word, and it did not feel as sturdy as it had a minute before. The porridge was still warm. She ate it standing at the counter after Zuri was asleep, and she hated how good it was. That was how it began. Not with grand gestures, but with a slow, terrifying accumulation of small ones. He did not send flowers. He sent, through Minjun to Zuri, a book of Korean folk tales with the hard words underlined in pencil because he'd noticed Zuri reading above her level. He did not ask Amara to dinner. He asked once, standing well back at the daycare door with his hands visible and his voice pitched for her ears only, whether she would object to him walking the 2 children to the bakery downstairs while she finished her grading, and he waited for the answer as though it mattered more than anything his men could bring him. She said yes. She told herself it was for the free half hour. It was not entirely for the free half hour. Seoul, of course, noticed. Seoul noticed everything. The whispers started at the hagwon first, in the low register's mother's reserve for the delicious and the forbidden. Amara had learned long ago to read a room she was being discussed in, the sudden interest in phones, the conversation that dropped a half-tone when she entered the teacher's lounge, the specific quality of a silence that has a shape carved out of it just her size. She heard the phrase before she was meant to. The foreign woman. And Kong. You know which Kong. And then a word she had to look up and wish she hadn't. Jokbo, they whispered, but not the family register kind. The other kind, the underworld kind. The ledger of men who moved things through the port at Incheon that were not on any manifest. She went home that night and searched his name, and the first cold finger became a whole cold hand. Kong Teo ran a logistics company. That was the clean word for it, the word on the building. The unclean words lived in old news articles she read by the blue light of her phone with Zuri breathing beside her. Articles that used careful legal language like alleged and no charges filed and under investigation. Articles about goods that vanished and rivals who retired suddenly to the countryside, and one prosecutor's office that had spent years trying to build a case out of smoke. He had never been convicted of anything. He had also never quite been clean, and the gap between those two facts was exactly the size of the men who bowed too low. She should have run. Any sensible woman would have run. She had a daughter and a wall and 3 years of hard-won invisibility, and here was a man whose visibility could swallow her whole. But she thought about the coat toggle. And she thought about a country that had made her furniture, and how this man, whatever else he was, had never once looked at her the way Junho's mother had looked at her. And she was so tired of being the only warmth in her daughter's life. "You're doing something stupid," Bok-sun told her flatly the next morning, ladling sajibi, because Bok-sun knew everything that happened in that Jimjilbang and most of what happened in the district. That quiet man with the shoes. "He asks about you now. Did you know that? Tips me a 50 and asks, is Yuri Amara eating enough?" She jabbed the ladle in Amara's direction. "Men like that don't ask questions they don't already know the answer to. Be careful, girl. A soft voice is the most expensive thing a dangerous man owns." "He's just a father," Amara said. "So was your husband," said Bok-sun, and then looked stricken, because it had come out sharper and truer than she meant, and the two women stood in the steam of the anchovy broth and did not know what to do with it. The thing about Zuri and Minjun, though, the thing that wore Amara's caution down faster than anything Kong himself could have done, was that they were becoming a fact she could not argue with. Zuri had not laughed like this since before. Amara had almost forgotten the specific sound of her daughter's Real laugh, the ugly honking one that came out only when the child forgot to guard herself, and Minjun produced it reliably, usually by being so relentlessly literal that Zuri's whys broke against him like waves on a rock. She asked him once, testing, why the sky was blue, expecting the interrogation to unsettle him as it unsettled adults, and Minjun thought for a long, serious moment and said, "Because if it was green, we'd get confused about the grass." And Zuri laughed the honking laugh so hard she fell off the bench, and Amara, watching from across the room, had to turn away and press her knuckles to her mouth. The children invented a two-country world between them without being told to. Minjun learned to say Kidu for hello because Zuri taught him her grandmother's word, and Zuri taught Minjun that jollof rice and bibimbap were the same food being brave in different languages, a theory she defended with the ferocity of a small scholar. And Zuri, who called almost no adult anything at all, began, carefully, testing the weight of it, to call Kong Ajiasi, uncle, Mr. The honorific a child gives a grown man, she has decided is safe. Amara heard it the first time and felt her stomach drop, because she knew what it meant. It meant the wall was gone. Not lowered. Gone. And she had not been the one to take it down. Kong heard it too. Amara watched his still face do something it did not know how to do. Watched a man who ran an empire get ambushed by one small word from a child who was not his, and she watched him look away quickly the way she looked away, and she understood that whatever this was, it was not one-sided. And it was not a game, and that was so much more frightening than if it had been. She decided, finally, to find the bottom of it. Not the man, the money. The scholarship, the porridge, she could explain as a decent impulse. But she was a forensic accountant's widow, and she had spent 7 years absorbing the way Junho thought at the kitchen table, the way he followed money, the way a hunter follows blood, and something about the shape of the kindness bothered her. It was too complete. It was too early. It had started before she and Kong had ever spoken. She still had one friend from Junho's world, a junior colleague of his named Haun, who had cried harder at the funeral than Junho's own relatives and who now worked at a mid-sized firm doing the honest, boring work of tracing money through shell companies. Amara took her to a pojangmaka tent on a cold night, bought her tteokbokki and soju, and asked her, as casually as she could manage, to look into a foundation. Just the structure. Just where it sat. Haun called her back 4 days later, and her voice was strange. "The foundation's clean on paper," she said. "Registered charity, real board, real filings. But I followed the funding up the way you asked. Amara, the money that seeded it, the parent entity, it routes through a holding company." She paused, and Amara heard papers shuffle, heard a woman deciding how to say a hard thing. "It's one of Kong Taoa's. The porridge man. I think you already knew that part. But that's not why I called." "Then why did you call?" Amara said, and the pojangmaka tent and the whole city seemed to go very quiet around her. "Because the holding company," Haun said. "The name. I recognized it. Amara, I recognized it from Junho's files. The audit. The one he wouldn't talk about. The one he was working on when she stopped. That company. It's the same company. The one your husband was investigating the month he died is the same company that's quietly been paying for your daughter's shoes." Amara did not remember hanging up the phone. She remembered the cold. She remembered the specific rubbery texture of the tteokbokki going tasteless in her mouth. She remembered thinking, with a clarity that felt like falling, that she had let this man walk her children to the bakery. She confronted him the next night. She did not plan to. She had planned to be cold and careful and to gather more before she moved. But he arrived at the daycare to collect Minjun, and she looked at his still face and the careful, gentle way he had with the children, and the whole thing rose up in her throat and came out. "Why us?" she said, low, in the empty stairwell where the children couldn't hear. Not the question she'd asked before. A harder one. The real reason. Not the lunch. Not the coat. "You found us before you ever met us. You reached down into the worst part of the city and picked out my daughter's name before your son had ever said it to you. A man like you does nothing by accident. So tell me, why us?" For a long moment she thought he would lie. She saw him choose not to, and she saw what it cost him. "Because I help people who deserve better than what this country gave them," he said. "That's true. It's not the whole truth. But it's true." His jaw worked. "Amara, there are things I've done that I can't undo. Things I carry. Helping you, it's the closest I get to setting one of them down, even for an hour. Please don't ask me what I'm setting down. Not yet. I'm not." His voice, that low, steady voice, cracked for the first time she had ever heard. "I'm not ready to lose the way you look at me. It's the only thing in 10 years that's made me feel like a person and not what they call me." And Amara, God help her, almost believed it was enough. Almost let it be enough. Because she wanted it to be, and because she was tired, and because a woman can carry only so many unanswered questions before she starts letting some of them sleep. But the viewer knows what Amara did not. The viewer has not forgotten what the little girl saw in the doorway, the thing that turned her to stone. The viewer knows there is a watch coming. She let it be enough for 11 days. 11 good days, the best she'd had in 3 years, which was its own cruelty, though she couldn't know it yet. And on the 11th day, Kong Teo asked if he could cook for them. It undid her that he asked at all. Not commanded, not arranged, not send a chef. Asked. He stood in the doorway of her half-basement, which he had never once tried to enter, and he said he was a terrible cook, but there was one thing his own mother had taught him before she passed, one thing he could make, and he'd like to make it for the girls, if she'd allow him into her kitchen. And Amara looked at this enormous, dangerous, careful man asking permission to stand at her stove, and she stepped back and opened the door. He made doenjang jjigae. Amara did not tell him what that stew meant. She could not have gotten the words out. She stood in the doorway of her own tiny kitchen and watched a man she should have feared stir soybean paste into anchovy broth exactly the way her dead husband had stirred it the night he proposed, badly, with too much salt, the tofu falling apart into the broth, and she pressed her hand over her mouth and did not make a sound. The girls set the table. Minjun folded the napkins into triangles because his mother used to, and Zuri copied him without being asked. And when Kong ladled the stew into bowls and set one in front of Zuri, the child who had spent 3 years politely refusing to admit any food was as good as her father's, took one careful spoonful and went still, and then looked up at her mother with her eyes full and said, in a small, wondering voice, "Amma, it tastes like home." Amara had to leave the room. She stood in the dark of the tiny hallway with her back against the damp wall and wept as silently as she could, because for the first time since a car went off an expressway in the rain, her daughter had tasted home and found it, and it had been ladled out by a stranger's hands, and she thought, she let herself think, for the length of one breath, maybe I could have this. Maybe the world is not only fair or only cruel. Maybe it can give something back. She wiped her face. She went back in. She would have this dinner if it killed her. And it was then, as she sat down and reached for her own spoon, that Zuri's chopstick slipped off the edge of the table and clattered to the floor beside Kang's chair, and the little girl bent down to retrieve it, and came face to face, at exactly her own eye level, with the wrist of the man reaching down to help her. With the watch on his wrist, the scratched face, the leather strap, cracked and repaired and cracked again. The old automatic that ticked with a sound just loud enough that a baby laid against a chest could feel it as much as hear it. The sound she had fallen asleep to every night of her life, until the night it stopped. Zuri did not scream. She did not cry. She simply went rigid, 6 years old and carved from stone, one hand frozen halfway to the fallen chopstick, staring at the thing on the stranger's wrist that could not possibly be there, that had been in a car that went into the dark, that his grandmother said did not exist. And in the warm little kitchen that smelled of home, over a stew that tasted like her father, the child began, very quietly, to shake. "Zuri." Amara's voice came out wrong. "Baby, pick up your chopstick." The child did not move. Kong had gone still too, not the practiced stillness he wore like a coat, but the real thing, the stillness of a man who has felt a floor shift under him. He followed the child's stare down to his own wrist, and Amara watched the color leave his face, watched the empire drain out of him until there was nothing left in the chair but a frightened man, and she did not understand yet. She only knew that her daughter was shaking and this man was afraid, and the stew was going cold, and something was terribly, terribly wrong. "What is it?" Amara said. "Zuri, what do you see what's wrong?" "Amara." Kang's voice was barely a voice. "Let me explain." "Explain what?" She was on her feet now without deciding to stand. She's frightened. What is there to? And then her own eyes went to his wrist, because a mother follows her child stare the way water follows the low ground, and she saw it. She saw it the way you see your own name in a stranger's mouth. For a moment it meant nothing, an old watch, a common enough thing. And then the years peeled back all at once. 3 years of a child pressing her ear to a silence. 3 years of there was no watch. 3 years of a folded grief she had carried down into the dark, and the scratched face resolved into the only scratched face it could ever have been, and the room tilted, and Amara Okafor reached out and gripped the edge of her own kitchen table to keep from going down. "Where?" she said. She could not manage more than the one word. "Where did you?" Minjun looked between the 3 frozen adults and his frozen friend, a 6-year-old suddenly aware that something enormous was happening that no one would explain, and did the only thing that made sense to him. He reached over and quietly picked up Zuri's fallen chopstick and set it back on the table where it belonged, as though tidiness could put right whatever had just broken open in that room. It could not. Nothing could now. The watch was on the table between all of them, still ticking, still keeping the time it had kept through a wedding and a birth and a death and 3 years of a widow's silence, and it was about to speak, at last, and tell Amara exactly what her husband had died for, and who had been sitting at her table, eating her stew, teaching her daughter to laugh. Before we continue, a quick note for everyone who loves these Mafia Boss romance stories. I've bundled 20 of our most loved Afro-Korean romance stories into the Ultimate Mafia Boss Love Collection. You'll get all 15 complete stories, 20 audiobook versions, plus 5 exclusive bonus stories you won't find on YouTube. If you'd love to enjoy these stories anytime without ads or interruptions, you'll find the link in the description below. He told her everything. He had to. The watch had already told the first and worst of it, and a man cannot half open a grave. But he asked her first, in a voice scraped down to nothing, if the children could be sent to the other room. Amara nodded. She could not speak. Minjun took Zuri's hand, Zuri, who was still shaking, who had not blinked, and led her into the tiny bedroom where the cartoon damp stains lived on the wall, and he did not ask her what was wrong, because he was a child who understood that some questions only make the answer heavier. He just sat with her on the floor beside the fat sleeping cat stain and held her hand, 2 children on the wrong side of a closed door while the adults on the other side took apart the world. Kong set the watch on the table. He could not seem to keep it on his wrist another second, now that it had been seen for what it was. "Your husband was Seo Junho," he said. It was not a question. "The forensic accountant. I knew his name before I knew yours. I've known it for 3 years. He pressed the heels of his hands against his eyes, an oddly human gesture from so large a man. "I didn't know you were his. Not at first. Okafor, I didn't connect it. There was no reason to think. And then one day at the daycare, I heard a teacher say your full name, and I heard your daughter call you Amma, and I did the arithmetic, and I have not slept properly since." "Say it plainly," Amara said. Her voice had gone flat and hard, a voice she did not recognize as her own. "You've said a great many careful sentences to me. Say this one plainly. How do you have my husband's watch?" So he said it plainly. 3 years ago, he told her, he had run the same logistics operation he ran now, moving the same goods through the same port, in the same gray space between the clean word and the unclean ones. And 3 years ago, a forensic accountant working an audit for a client bank had followed a thread of money the way a hunter follows blood, straight into the heart of an operation that could not survive being seen. Not Kang's operation alone. Something larger, Older, above him, a structure of men to whom Kong answered, men who did not tolerate light.
Junho had found the thread.
Junho had been close, stays close, to pulling it all the way out. I want to be exact with you, Kong said, because you deserve exactness, and because if I make myself sound better than I am, you'll hear it. You're his wife. You'll hear the lie.
So,
I did not order it. I want you to know that, not because it makes me innocent. It does not, but because you should have the true shape of the thing you're going to hate me for. I did not know they were going to do it. I knew your husband was a problem. I said so, in a room, to the men above me. I said, the accountant is getting close. That is all I said. I thought they would buy him or frighten him or bury the paperwork. I did not know they would. Say it, Amara said. They ran him off the expressway, Kong said. In the rain. They made it look like the road. And it was clean. It was so clean the police never blinked. And afterward, one of the men who did it brought me a box of the things they'd taken from the car, because that is the protocol. You sanitize, you remove anything that connects. And in the box, there was a watch. He looked at it on the table. An old automatic. Scratched. A repaired strap. Nothing valuable. They'd almost thrown it in the river. And I don't know why I kept it. I have asked myself for 3 years. I kept it because it was the one human thing in a box full of a man's erased life, and I could not put it in the river, and I could not give it back without confessing, and so I kept it, and I have carried the man I helped kill on my wrist every day since, as the only penance I was brave enough to pay. The kitchen was very quiet. The stew had gone cold and gray in its bowls. Somewhere far above them a scooter went by in the alley, and the ordinary sound of it was obscene. The scholarship, Amara said slowly. She was assembling it now, piece by piece, the forensic accountant's widow doing the arithmetic her husband had taught her at this very kind of table. The porridge.
The rent.
My landlord who suddenly forgave 3 months. That was you. All of it was you. Yes. Because of guilt. Yes. You looked at the woman your world had widowed, and the child your world had orphaned, and you decided the way to feel better about it was to buy her shoes, to pay her rent, to ladle out my husband's own stew to my husband's own daughter, and watch her say it tasted like home. Amara was not shouting. That was the terrible part. She was speaking very softly, and each soft word landed like a blow. You made yourself into our miracle. Do you understand what you did? For 3 years I have been trying to teach my daughter that the world can still be kind. And the kindness, the one kindness that finally reached us, was you, feeling better about her father's grave. Kong made a sound that was not quite a word. I did not plan to feel, he started. I know you didn't, she said, and that was worse than if she'd screamed, because it was true, and they both knew it, and the truth of it sat in the room like a fourth person. That's what I can't survive. If you'd planned it, I could hate you cleanly. But you fell into my daughter's lap the same way I fell into your careful hands and your ruined stew, and now I have to hate a man who is the closest thing to a father my child has had in 3 years, and I have to do it tonight, at this table, over this exact food. And here, if you have been carrying this story with Amara, if the pumpkin porridge and the coat toggle and the 2 halves of a tangerine built something in your chest across this hour, here's the place to press pause for 1 second and tap that subscribe button, because what Amara did next is the reason this channel exists, and staying with her through it is the whole point. Now back to that cold kitchen. Amara did not throw him out.
She wanted to.
Every cell in her body that had spent 3 years building walls wanted to open the door and shove the empire and the guilt and the watch back out into the alley where they came from. But she was Junho's widow, and she had absorbed more of him than his math, and some quiet, unbearable part of her had already leapt past her own grief to a colder, sharper question. "The men above you," she said. "The ones who did it. Who are they?" Kong went still in a new way.
Amara. No.
"You said you were exact with me. Be exact now. My husband found something worth killing him for, and it's still out there, and you know exactly where. You've known for 3 years. You built a foundation to launder your guilt when you could have built a case to bury the men who—" Her voice finally broke on the last word, the only crack in the whole flat, terrible calm. "He died for what he found, Kong. And you kept his watch instead of his work. If I move against them," Kong said, very low, "I am dead. And then my son has no one. Do you understand? Min-jun has no mother. If I do what you're asking, he has no father either. I have spent 3 years choosing to keep my son a father over doing the thing you're about to ask me to do." "Then we understand each other," Amara said, "because I have spent 3 years choosing to keep my daughter a mother, which is why I have swallowed every insult this country has fed me and mopped every floor and never once made a sound. Don't tell me about the cost of staying alive for a child. I wrote the book you're quoting." They stared at each other across the ruined stew, two parents who had each spent 3 years making themselves smaller to keep a child safe, and something passed between them that was not love and was not hate, but was the terrible recognition of a matched wound. And then the bedroom door opened, and Zuri stood in it. She had stopped shaking. That was the first thing Amara saw, and it frightened her more than the shaking had, because her daughter's face had gone to a place children's faces should not be able to go. Zuri crossed the kitchen. She walked past her mother. She walked up to Kong Teo, this enormous man folded small in a kitchen chair, and she looked at the watch on the table, and then she looked up into his face with her father's own directness, the why that was never a question, and she said, "You had my daddy's watch." "Yes," Kong said. He did not look away from her. Amara would give him that for the rest of her life. He did not look away from the child. "I did." He never took it off. Zuri's voice was very clear and very small. "Not ever." He only would have took it off if, and there the child's forensic logic, her father's logic, arrived at the end of its own thread, and Amara saw the exact instant her 6-year-old understood and started forward to stop it, and was too late. "He only would have took it off if he was gone," Zuri finished. "So you were there. When he got gone. You were there." The kitchen held its breath. "I was not there," Kong said. "But I could have stopped the men who were, and I didn't, and that is the same as being there, and you're right to look at me the way you're looking at me. Don't stop. Whatever your mother decides, don't ever stop looking at me like that. It's the truest thing anyone has said to me in 3 years." And Zuri, who had frozen in a gymnasium, who had frozen at this table, who had carried her father's silence in her small body for half her life, did the thing that broke every adult in that room. She picked up the watch. She held it to her ear. She listened to it tick, the sound she had fallen asleep to and then been denied, the sound her mother had tried and failed to mimic with her own mouth against a baby's back. And her face crumpled all at once, the stone giving way, and she began to cry the way she had not let herself cry at 3 years old, because at 3 you do not yet understand what forever means. "It still works," she wept. It still works. It never stopped. It was ticking this whole time, and we didn't know." Amara went down on her knees on the kitchen floor and gathered her daughter and the watch and all of it into her arms, and over the child's shaking shoulders, she looked at the man who had brought her husband's heartbeat back into the house, and she did not know, she genuinely did not know, whether she was looking at the worst thing that had ever happened to her or a second chance wearing its face.
Both.
It was both. That was the cruelty, and that was the truth. Later, much later, when Zuri had cried herself to sleep in the bedroom with the watch clutched in both hands and Minjun asleep beside her, because no one had the heart to separate them, the two adults sat at the table with the cold stew still between them, because neither had been able to bear clearing it. "There's more," Amara said. It was not a guess. She had been assembling all night, and the structure had a hole in it, one last piece that had not yet been set. Junho's family, his mother. When I asked her for the watch, the one thing I asked her for, the only thing, she told me it didn't exist. She said there was no watch, and she hung up, and I believed her. Amara's eyes came up, and they were terrible. How did his mother know to deny a watch that was in a box in your possession? How did she know to deny it existed at all, unless someone told her it did? Kong closed his eyes. "Say it plainly," Amara said, for the third time that night. "The client bank your husband was auditing," Kong said. "The one that hired him. The board. The old money." He opened his eyes.
Amara.
"The CO family. Your husband's family. Their capital was in it. The thing he found, the thing he was days from pulling out into the light, it would have taken down the men above me, yes. But it would also have taken down his own family's fortune. Everything. The land, the name, 3 generations of it." He said the last part so quietly she had to lean in to hear the thing that would recolor every memory she owned. "They didn't close the door on you because you were foreign, Amara. That was the story they let you believe because it was a story you'd already been taught to accept. They closed the door because your husband died finding out what they'd done, and they could not have his widow anywhere near the thing he'd found. The rejection wasn't racism. It was a cover-up wearing racism's face. It was cheaper for them to let you think they hated your skin than to let you wonder why they were really burying you." And there it was, the last piece set into the hole, completing the terrible structure. 3 years Amara had carried the specific wound of being made furniture at her husband's funeral, being told there was no watch, being erased for the color of her skin by a family too proud to claim her child. 3 years she had built her understanding of her own life on that foundation. And it had been a lie laid over a deeper crime. Her husband had not been rejected despite being honest. She had been erased because he was honest, because his honesty had aimed itself at his own bloodline, and they had buried the truth and the man and the woman and the child all in one efficient motion, and let her believe it was only prejudice, because prejudice was a wound she already knew how to survive. Amara sat very still in her half-basement kitchen, under the damp-stained animals, beside the cold stew, across from the man who had killed her husband by staying silent and kept his heartbeat by staying guilty, and she understood at last the full and exact shape of what had been done to her family. And something in her, some last soft thing that had survived 3 years of floors and silence and Yuri Amara and pumpkin porridge, went hard and clear and still. She was not going to run. She was done running. "Tomorrow," Amara said, "you're going to tell me everything you know. Every name, every account, everything my husband found, and everything they did to bury it." She stood. She picked up the 2 bowls of cold stew, at last, and carried them to the sink, and her hands did not shake. "You've spent 3 years wearing his watch to feel your guilt, Kong. That's over. Guilt is a thing you feel. I'm not interested in what you feel." She turned on the tap. "I'm interested in what you're willing to lose." He did not answer that night. She had not expected him to. A man does not decide to die for a stranger's justice between the soup and the sink, and Amara was enough of a realist to know that the resolve she'd found in herself could not be transplanted into him by force. She sent him home. He gathered his sleeping son from beside her sleeping daughter, and Minjun stirred and murmured and did not fully wake, and at the door Kong stopped with the boy in his arms, and the watch still on the table, where Zuri had left it. "Keep it," he said, looking at it. "It was never mine. It should never have been mine. I only ask," he stopped. "You don't get to ask for anything," Amara said, not cruelly, just as fact. "No," he agreed. "I don't." And he carried his son up the basement stairs into the Seoul night, and Amara stood in her doorway and watched the man go, and did not know if he would come back changed or come back afraid, or not come back at all. She barely slept. In the gray hour before dawn, she gave up and dressed and went to the one place in the city that had ever felt like it might hold her. Boksun was already at the jjimjilbang, already ladling, the anchovy broth already fragrant in the empty pre-dawn bathhouse. She took one look at Amara's face and set down the ladle and came around the counter, which she had never once done, and put a hand the size and texture of a garden glove against Amara's cheek. "Who died?" Boksun said. Not unkindly. She was a woman who had buried a husband and 2 brothers, and did not flinch at the word. "No one," Amara said. "Everyone. 3 years ago." And then, because Boksun was the only person in 10 million who had ever called her ours, she told her. Not all of it, but enough. The watch. The man. The family. The lie under the lie. Boksun listened without a single interruption, which for Boksun was a kind of miracle, and when Amara finished, the old woman was quiet for a long moment, stirring the broth that did not need stirring. "You know what jong is," Boksun said finally. It was not quite a question. "The thing we have that you foreigners never have a word for. Everyone tells it to you wrong. They say it's affection. Warmth. The soft feeling between people who've shared a pot of soup." She shook her head slowly. "That's the tourist version. Jong isn't the soft thing, girl. Jong is the thing that stays after the soft thing is gone. It's the bond you can't cut even when you want to, even when the person has hurt you, even when every sensible bone says walk away. It's not given by people who owe you nothing." She looked up, and her old eyes were sharp. "It's given by people who owe you everything and stay to pay it. Anyone can love you on an easy day. Jong is who's still at your table on the worst one." Amara sat with that in the steam of the empty bathhouse. "He owes me a debt he can never pay," she said. "Yes," said Boksun, ladling out a bowl of sujibi and pushing it across the counter. "So, the only question that matters is whether he stays to try, or whether he runs like the men above him ran their whole lives. That's not about your heart, girl. Forget your heart. Your heart's been lied to too many times to trust. That's about his spine." She tapped the counter.
Eat.
"You're too thin. Thin women make bad decisions." Amara ate. And somewhere across the city, in a penthouse that was everything her half-basement was not, Kong Teo sat awake with his sleeping son and a phone in his hand and a number in it that he had never once dialed, the number of a prosecutor's office that had spent years trying to build a case out of smoke, and for the first time in 3 years, he was thinking about picking up the phone. But he had not dialed it yet, and the men above him had eyes everywhere. And Amara had just told an old woman in a bathhouse a secret that, spoken in the wrong ear, could get a widow and her daughter run off an expressway of their own. She did not know that yet. She finished her soup. She thanked her emo. She went to wake her daughter for school, the watch ticking now on Zuri's wrist, wound with the child's own careful fingers, keeping a heartbeat that had outlived the man whose it was. The reckoning was coming, but it would not come the way any of them expected. He dialed it 3 days later. Amara knew the exact hour, because he told her afterward, and because those 3 days had been the longest of her life since the ones that followed a car going off an expressway. For 3 days, she went to work and taught 7-year-olds the difference between I want and I would like, and she did not know whether the man who held her family's justice in his hands was going to be brave or was going to run, and she had decided somewhere around the second sleepless night that she could not build her daughter's future on his spine. If he ran, she would go to the prosecutors herself, with the watch and Haun's paper trail and everything Junho had left behind, and she would probably lose, and they would probably bury her the way they buried her husband, but she would not spend one more year mopping floors on top of a lie. She was drafting that plan at her kitchen table, in Junho's own posture, when Kong called and said he had spent the morning in a room with a prosecutor named Prosecutor Yoon, and he had not come out the same man who went in. I gave them everything, he said. His voice was strange, hollowed out, but lighter, the way a house is lighter after a fire. Names, accounts, the routing through the port, the night your husband, the men who did it, where they were, who sent them. I gave them the Seo family's exposure, the capital, all of it. Amara, I confess my own part. Do you understand what that means? I put myself in the box with them. Prosecutor Yoon offered me considerations for cooperating, but I am not walking away from this clean. I made sure of that. I told him to write down every silence I kept for 3 years. A pause. I could not sit at your table again as a man who let it happen and paid nothing. So I made sure I pay. Amara gripped the phone. You know what they'll do to you. The men above you. Yes. They'll kill you the way they killed him. They'll try, Kong said. Prosecutor Yoon has moved us, Min-jun and me, somewhere. There are people watching the building. It won't hold forever. Men like the ones above me have long arms and longer patience. Another pause, longer. But your husband found something days from pulling into the light, and then the light went out for 3 years because everyone who knew was too afraid to hold it up. I decided I'm done being the reason it stayed dark. Whatever happens to me now, the light's up. It's in Yoon's hands. They can't kill all of us. And Amara understood that this was the thing Bok-sun had meant, not the soft feeling, the spine. The man had stayed at the table on the worst possible day, and he had paid, and he was still paying, and he had done it knowing it might cost him the one thing he'd spent 3 years protecting. Min-jun, she said. That's the thing I have to ask you, Kong said, and for the first time his voice failed. It's the only thing I'll ever ask you, and you have every right on earth to say no. If something happens to me, if the long arms reach, my son has no one, Amara. His mother's gone, and my family is the men in that box. There's no one. Except that in 3 months he learned to fold napkins into triangles again because your daughter copied him, and he laughs now. I hear him laughing through the wall, and I'd forgotten what it sounded like. If something happens to me, will you?
Don't, Amara said.
Don't ask it over phone. Then I won't ask it at all, he said. I have no right. Forget I mean, Amara said, and her own voice cracked now. Don't ask it over a phone. Ask me when you're standing in my kitchen. Come to dinner. Bring your son. We'll clear the good stew this time, instead of letting it go cold. And you'll ask me like a person, at a table, the way you should have asked me everything from the start. There was a silence on the line so complete she could hear the man breathing. You'd let me back in your kitchen, he said. After. I haven't decided anything, Amara said, which was true and was not true, in the way the most important things are both. I've decided one thing. My daughter is not going to grow up learning that when a man does a terrible thing, and then does the hardest right thing: we slam the door anyway. That's the CO family's lesson. Face over blood. I'm not raising a CO. She wiped her face. Come to dinner. That's all it is. Dinner. The case broke slowly, then all at once, the way these things do when the smoke finally has a fire under it. Prosecutor Yoon had spent years unable to build anything that would stand, because everyone who knew was either paid or frightened or dead, and a case made of smoke does not survive a courtroom. But a case made of a cooperating insider, a forensic audit recovered from a dead accountant's own files, a paper trail traced by an honest junior analyst named Haun, and a watch pulled from the wreck of a murdered man. That was not smoke. That was iron. The arrests came over a period of weeks. The men above Kong, the ones with the long arms, discovered that arms are only long until someone with a badge is holding your wrist. And the CO family, the old Taegu money, the land, the name, 3 generations of face, woke one morning to find their capital named in an indictment and their fortune frozen and their pride, that most expensive thing they owned, spread across every news channel in the country. Amara did not gloat. She had expected to and found she couldn't. When she saw Junho's mother's face on the news, the woman who had made her furniture, who had said there was no watch and hung up, she felt no triumph, only a strange, exhausted grief for how much cruelty a person will manufacture to protect a lie they've mistaken for their honor. But there was one thing she made sure of. She went to Prosecutor Yoon herself, and she gave a statement, on the record in careful Korean and blunt English both, and she made them write it into the case the way Kong had made them write down his silences. She made them establish, in a document that would outlive all of them, exactly what Seo Junho had been. Not a man who died driving too fast in the rain. A forensic accountant who followed the money into his own family's crime and did not look away, who was days from pulling the truth into the light when the light was put out, who died honest in a country that had every reason to make him lie. She made them write his name correctly. She made them put the K in Okafor where her father put it, next to his husband and wife, on the record, in the country that had tried to erase them both. And the country at last claimed them, not warmly, not with open arms, but officially, permanently, in ink. The honest man and the widow he'd married against his mother's will, named together in the case that broke the thing he'd died finding. It was not the citizenship of open arms Amara had dreamed of at 26, stepping off a plane certain the world was fair. It was harder and colder, and it had cost more than she'd ever imagined a person could pay. But it was real, and it was hers, and no one could pack it into a box and carry it away while she stood at a funeral hall being treated like a rumor. Kong went to prison. This is not the kind of story where the man who confessed walks free because his heart was in the right place. Amara would not have respected him if he had, and he knew it, and that was perhaps the truest thing about him. He served time, less than the men above him, because he cooperated, but time, real time, the price written down exactly as he demanded. And on visiting days, more often than a sensible woman should have, a black woman and 2 children took the long train out of Seoul to a facility in the countryside, and a girl with a watch on her wrist, and a boy who still folded his napkins into triangles sat across a table from a large, quiet man and taught him the 2 country games they'd invented, and Amara watched, and did not call it love, because love was too small and too easy a word for the thing that was being built across that prison table, brick by brick, on the worst days, which is the only place the real thing is ever built. The first prison visit was a disaster, and Amara has laughed about it since, which is how she knows the family survived it. She had not planned to bring the children. She had planned to go alone once, to say a hard, clean thing to Kang's face, and then decide the rest with a clear head. But Zuri had heard the word prison through the thin wall of the half-basement, and had appeared in the kitchen doorway in her pajamas with the watch on her wrist and her father's flat Y in her eyes, and had informed her mother that Minjun's appa was Minjun's only appa, and you did not make a person visit their only appa alone. That was the rule. And Amara had discovered that her daughter had begun making rules for the family the way her father used to make them, quietly, immovably, and that arguing was a waste of a morning. So they all went. And the countryside facility was cold, and the visiting rooms smelled of disinfectant, and the guard looked at the black woman and the two mismatched children with a face Amara had spent 9 years learning to read, and it was awful. All of it, until Kong came through the door in the drab clothes that made him look somehow larger and more human at once, and Minjun stood up so fast he knocked his chair over. And in the ringing silence of that grim room, Zuri looked at the fallen chair and said, with the exact timing of a child who has been saving a joke, "You have to fold it into a triangle first." And Minjun laughed. The honking, ugly, real laugh. He caught it from Zuri the way you catch a cold, and it burst out of him in that terrible room and bounced off the disinfectant walls, and the hard-faced guard's mouth twitched despite himself, and Kong put his enormous hand over his own eyes and his shoulders shook, and Amara could not tell, and never asked, whether the man was laughing or weeping, and decided it didn't matter, because in that family the two things had long ago stopped being opposites. They came back. That was the thing Amara had not expected of herself. Not the first visit, which was grief and duty, but the fourth and the ninth, and the long train rides that became ordinary, that became the shape of a season. Zuri's face against the window watching the rice paddies blur, Minjun folding the train tickets into triangles, Amara grading her students' workbooks with a red pen while two children invented the fifth new rule of a two-country game. She told herself, for a while, that she was doing it for Minjun, who had no one. It was Bok-sun who took that lie away from her too. "You've started humming," the old woman observed one dawn, ladling broth, months into the train rides. "You didn't used to hum. Thin women who hum are in trouble." "I'm not in any trouble," Amara said. "The man is in prison." "Prison ends," said Bok-sun, with the certainty of a woman who had waited out worse. "And then he'll be standing in your kitchen with nowhere to go and a boy who calls your daughter his sister, and you'll have to decide whether the door opens or stays shut. You've decided already. You decided the night you told him to come to dinner instead of throwing him down the stairs. You just haven't told your own face yet." She pushed the sajibi across the counter.
"Eat."
"Stop humming. It's distracting the retirees." And the retirees, in fact, had noticed. The whole Jimjilbang had adopted Yuri Amara over the years, the way a neighborhood slowly, grudgingly, then completely, takes a person in, the old men who nodded to her now over their morning soak, the ajumas who saved her the good eggs, the manager who had once assumed she was lucky to have the job and now, quietly, without ever saying so, saved her shifts around the prison train schedule. It was not the citizenship of open arms. It was the citizenship of a bathhouse before dawn, earned one mopped floor and one shared bowl at a time, and Amara had come, over the years, to understand that it was the only kind that had ever been real, not the country claiming you in a grand gesture, but a handful of its hardest people deciding, one by one, that your table was worth sitting at. That was the thing the Seo family had never had and never understood, for all their land and all their face. They had Jokbo, the family register, the bloodline written down for generations. They had never once had Jong. And when the indictment froze their fortune and the cameras came, Amara understood that she had ended up, against every odd the world had offered her. The richer of the two households, a half-basement and a prison train and a bathhouse auntie and two laughing children and a watch that would not stop ticking, against 3 generations of money that could not buy a single person willing to sit at the worst table. She thought about telling Junho's mother that once. She drafted the sentence in her head on a prison train, somewhere past Taejun. And then she let it go, because the woman would never understand it, and because Amara had finally, after all these years, stopped needing the people who had erased her to understand anything at all. That, too, was a kind of freedom, maybe the last one she'd been waiting for. Then the spring came when the visits would end, and a chair needed saving at a parent's day, and a boy crossed a polished floor to ask a question a whole story had been walking toward. The years passed the way they do. And on a bright, cold morning in the plum rain season, 1 year, and then another after a watch fell off the edge of a table, there was a parents' day at an elementary school in a better part of the city than a half-basement, and 40 folding chairs, and the smell of steamed rice cakes. Amara sat in the 3rd row in a galley her mother had shipped from Lagos, gold and impossible, next to an empty chair she was holding for a man on a countryside train who would be released in the spring. Zuri stood at the front of the class with her father's watch ticking on her wrist, reading an essay she'd written about her family, and she read it in Korean and then, because her teacher had said she could, in Igbo, and not one parent in that room looked away, because Amara Okafor had spent years making sure the school knew exactly whose daughter this was. And when Zuri finished, Minjun, taller now, still serious, still folding the world into neat triangles, crossed the polished floor in front of everyone, the way a smaller boy had crossed a gymnasium floor a lifetime ago. He walked up to Amara. He took her hand in both of his. And with the whole room watching, he asked the question that had frozen a little girl into stone 2 years before, the question this entire story has been walking toward. "Can my dad keep your mommy?" he said. "Just for today?" But this time Zuri did not freeze. This time the little girl who had carried her father's silence in her body, who had listened to a stolen heartbeat tick back to life in a cold kitchen, who had looked a guilty man in the eye and refused to look away, this time she crossed the floor to stand beside her friend, and she looked at the empty chair being saved for a man on a train, and she answered for her mother, in a voice clear as a temple bell, the way her father used to speak. "Not just today," Zuri said. "But he doesn't get to keep her for free. He has to earn every single day. That's the rule." She lifted her wrist, the watch catching the light. "My daddy's still counting." And Amara Okafor, who had come to Korea at 26 certain the world was fair, and learned at 32 that it was cruel, and understood at last, somewhere in the years of prison trains and bathhouse soup and a stew that tasted like home, that it was neither, that the world is not fair and is not cruel but is only, ever, exactly as good as the people who refuse to run from its worst tables. Reached out and took her daughter's hand, and did not say yes, and did not say no. She said, "We'll see." And she let the man keep coming home to find out. If you enjoyed this story, imagine having 20 more unforgettable Mafia Boss romances ready to read or listen to whenever you want. That's exactly why I created the Ultimate Mafia Boss Love Collection. Inside, you'll find 15 complete stories, 20 audiobook versions, and 5 exclusive bonus stories that aren't available on YouTube. You can get instant access through the link in the description. Hit that subscribe button, smash that like, and drop a comment telling us where you're watching from, because this channel is built entirely on stories like this one. If Zuri's story reached something in you, if you know what it is to be made furniture in your own life and to stand up anyway to build a family out of the wreckage of the one that was taken, then subscribe and stay with us, because there is always another table, another secret, another family deciding whether to run or to stay, and we are going to sit down at every one of them together. Thank you for listening, and I'll see you in the next story.